Welcome to the video for Chapter 8 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to teach you about absolutives, top participles and infinitives, and the internal sandhi that is needed to form them. There is one rather noticeable difference in how English and Sanskrit use their verb forms. If I have a sentence in English that describes several actions, such as she leaves the house, goes into the forest and smiles, or after she left the house and went into the forest, she smiled, I would typically describe all of these actions, each of these actions, by means of finite verbs. She leaves, goes, smiles, she left, went, smiled. In Sanskrit, on the other hand, typically only one action, usually the last one, will be expressed by a finite verb, whereas the other actions will be expressed using some other verb forms, usually non-finite verb forms, such as absolutives or participles. More literally, a Sanskrit sentence might thus say, having left the house and having gone into the forest, she smiled. Concerning these non-finite verb forms, there are three things we need to look at, namely how they're formed, what they mean, and how they're used. First of all, formation. Absolutives are formed by taking the zero grade of a verbal root and adding twa. Top participles, on the other hand, are formed by taking the zero grade of a verbal root, adding ta, and then adding a case ending. What do these forms mean? Well, the absolutive of a verb x would mean having x'd. So, for example, of drew, to run, we take the root and zero grade, drew, add twa, giving us drew twa, and so we have having run. Of kr, to do, kr twa, having done. The ta participle of a verb x, on the other hand, would be having been x'd. So, whereas the absolutive would be past active, the ta participle would typically be past passive. For example, of br, to carry, we get brta, having been carried, or of kr, to do, we would get krita, having been done. With top participles, we need to note one more thing concerning their meaning, and that is, if there is no sensible way of forming a passive of a verb, the top participle actually will have past active meaning, and so of bhu, to become or to be, we get the top participle bhuta, which would mean having been or having become, because having been beed or having been becomed or something like that, any way of forming a passive would basically be nonsensical, and whenever you cannot form a passive, the top participle has active meaning. There's one important difference in the usage of absolutives and top participles. Now, top participles are a-stem forms, they have case endings, and they can thus show agreement with and therefore unambiguously refer to any noun in a sentence. So, for example, in bhritam, palang, pashyami, we have pashyami, I see, palang, the fruit. Bhritam, in front of it, or bhritam through sandhi, is the accusative neuter singular of bhrita. Bhrita would be the top participle of br, meaning having been carried, and I can indicate that the thing that has been carried, the thing that bhrita refers to, is palam, by adding a case ending to bhrita that then expresses it agrees with palam. So we have bhritam, palam, pashyami, I see the having been carried fruit, or I see the carried fruit. Another example, palam jitaya kshatriyaya bhavati. Palam bhavati, the fruit is. Jitaya kshatriyaya. Kshatriyaya is for the warrior. It's the dative of kshatriyah, for the warrior. And we can then describe the warrior by means of jitaya if we take jita, which is the top participle of ji, meaning to defeat. So jita would be having been defeated. And we then add the dative singular masculine case ending to that, turning it into jitaya, to then mark that jitaya agrees with kshatriyaya. So palam jitaya kshatriyaya bhavati, the fruit is for the defeated warrior. So participles can agree with any noun. Absolutives, on the other hand, do not have endings and can thus not express agreement, and therefore, by convention, they are only ever used to refer to the agent of a sentence. So in an active sentence such as Grihan gatwa narah vishati, with the active verb vishati, we translate Grihan gatwa, having gone to the house, narach vishati, the man enters, and understand that gatva, having gone, needs to refer to the agent of this sentence, i.e. the subject, narach, and so we understand that gatva refers to the man. The man first goes and then enters, and so we arrive at having gone to the house, the man enters, or the man, having gone to the house, enters. There are some irregularities in how tap participles and absolutives are formed. In the case of some verbs whose roots end in a consonant, a short I appears before suffixes beginning with a T or actually with any other stop. This I does not change or affect the meaning of the form in any way, and you cannot predict whether a verb is going to have this I or not. So, for example, of lik, to write, we have a tap participle likita and an absolutive likitoire, so likita and likitoire. These just mean having been written and having written, so exactly as we would expect it. As said, the I is just a formal irregularity. It does not affect the meaning of the form in any way. If you're interested in why that I sometimes appears, there is a detailed note on that in chapter 21 in the book. Normally, you cannot predict whether a verb will have this I or not. However, in causatives and class 10 verbs, we do have some predictability, namely tap participles always end in ita and absolutives always end in ayitoire. So, for example, of pat, to fall, which is a class 1 verb, present tense patati, we get a causative patayati, causes someone to fall, makes someone fall. And of that, we have a tap participle patita, with the first syllable still in vrti, patita, having been caused to fall, and an absolutive patayitoire, having caused to fall. Another irregularity is that some verbs have guna of the root, not zero grade of the root, in their absolutives and tap participles. Which ones do that cannot be predicted. And also, again, this does not cause any change in the meaning of these tap participles or of these absolutives. And so this is relevant only in as far as it just should not confuse you. So raksh, to protect, gives us a tap participle rakshita. So both with the raksh, with the full grade, with the guna of the root and an I. And neither of those affects any change to the meaning of this tap participle. It's still past and it's still passive, rakshita, having been protected. And similarly with pat, to fall or to fly, we again have guna of the root, pat, and we have this I. And again, we don't have any changes to the meaning of the tap participle. Patita means having fallen or having flown, exactly as we would expect it, because remember, if you cannot form a sensible passive or a meaningful passive of a verb, the tap participle has active meaning. Another phenomenon that we need to take a closer look at in this context is sandhi. If you remember, sandhi literally means putting together, and it's a grammatical term used to talk about pronunciation changes that happen when either words are put together in the context of a sentence, or in the case of internal sandhi, when elements are put together to form a word. So, for example, when a suffix is added to a root, or an ending is added to a stem, and so on. In English, we have various examples of that. For example, the S at the end of he sinks to indicate third person singular, and at the end of cats, in order to indicate plural, is unvoiced. We have S and S, he sinks and cats, but in he sings and dogs, it's not a S, it's a Z, it's voiced counterpart. That's because this S in one case is preceded by an unvoiced sound, but the voiced Z is preceded by a voiced G. So here we have the same phenomenon that sounds standing next to each other can influence each other's pronunciation. Usually English does not write this down, does not render these pronunciation changes in writing. Sometimes, however, it does, especially in words that are inherited from Latin or Greek. So, for example, the little prefix in, meaning not or non, that we get in inevitable and inadequate, is written as impossible and improbable, with the N changing to the labial nasal M in front of the labial stop P. So it's not impossible, but impossible. We have already seen one instance of internal sandhi in Sanskrit, and that was the change of n to n in words that contain a vocalic r, a consonantal r, or sh. What is relevant here is the sandhi before t. A lot of internal sandhi concerning consonants consists of sounds changing and becoming easier to pronounce together, and very often that happens by means of these sounds becoming more similar to each other. So for example, if you look at a T, that is a voiceless, unaspirated stop, and what we find happening in internal sandhi before T is that stops lose their voice, so also become voiceless. So for example, in front of a T, a D will change into a T, so a D will change into a T. A voiced D will lose its voice and turn into voiceless T. Similarly, a B will change into a P, again voiced becoming voiceless, and so on. Another change that we find that perhaps is a little less intuitive is that palatal stops in front of a T turn into a velar, and specifically they turn into the voiceless, unaspirated velar K. To look at a couple of examples, chid, meaning to cut, does not have an absolutive chid twa, but rather the D changes into a T and we get chitwa, which is much easier to pronounce. Of much, to release, we do not get the absolutive muchtwa, but rather muktwa, with the ch changing into a k, so muktwa, having released. And of yuj, to join or to link, we have even more of a change happening. The j loses its voice in front of the unvoiced T, but also because j is a palatal sound, it doesn't just lose its voice, it also becomes palatal, so the j changes into a ch, and that ch changes into a k, and so we get from yuj, to join to link, we get yuk twa, having been joined. And of course there would be an exception to this principle of voice being lost in front of voiceless T, and this exception concerns stops that are both voiced and aspirated. Now these do not lose their qualities, do not lose their voice and aspiration in front of the T, but instead they pass on both the voice and the aspiration to the T, so T becomes voiced and aspirated, so dh, and this original voiced and aspirated sound loses its aspiration. So for example, a dh becomes a d, a bh becomes a b. This probably is the case because bh would be much more difficult to pronounce than bdh. To look at some examples, bud, meaning to awake, ends in dh, ends in a sound that is voiced and aspirated. This dh passes on both the voice and the aspiration to the T, and itself loses its aspiration, and so dh plus t result in dh, and so we have an absolutive buddha, meaning having woken up, having woken someone up. And from this, of course, we also get the ta participle buddha, changing into buddha, so the Buddha literally being the one that has been woken up, or less literally, that has found enlightenment, that has been enlightened. Another example involving not dh but bh is, for example, in lab, meaning to take. Here the bh passes on its voice and aspiration to the T, so the T again becomes dh. The bh loses its voice, becoming b, and so we have bdh. And so, for example, having taken, the absolutive would be lab dwa. To make this even more interesting, we then have cases of H before T developing in basically the same way, and that is because Sanskrit H often originally was a gh, so again a stop that is both voiced and aspirated, and this gh passes on its voice and aspiration to a following t, to change that into dh. Then the gh, the original gh, loses its aspiration, so it becomes just a g. And as a result of that, something that on the surface looks like an H plus T, underlyingly it's G plus T, then together develops into Gdh. So for example, of Dach to burn, we then have a tap participle dagdha, having been burnt, or an absolutive dagdha, meaning having burnt. Two more aspects of internal sandhi before t. First of all, sh, so the palatal S sound, the palatal sibilant, in front of a T changes into sh, the retroflex S sound, and after this retroflex sh, the T, the dental sound T, itself turns into the equivalent retroflex sound, namely into t. And so, for example, of drsh, to see, we have the ta participle drshta, where both the sh and the T of the ta have turned into their retroflex equivalents, so sh has become sh and t has become t, and together they're very straightforward to pronounce drshta. Finally, a piece of internal sandhi that's relevant before T, but also actually before other consonants. Now, before the dental stop, T, any nasal will turn into the dental nasal, namely N. The example that's relevant here actually does not appear in tap participles or absolutives, but it appears in a form that you're going to encounter for the first time in a minute, and that is the infinitive, which is formed by adding tum. Now, if I add tum to gum tum is a little awkward to pronounce, and so what happens, the M, the labial nasal, just turns into the dental nasal in front of the dental T, in front of the dental stop T, so we don't have gumtum, but we have gantum. Now this is part of a larger system of internal sandhi. For example, before a velar stop, a nasal will appear as the velar nasal ng. Before a palatal stop, it will appear as the palatal nasal, and so on. However, before consonants that are not stops, nasals usually appear as anuswara, so as just the nasalization over a vowel that is written as an M with a dot underneath, so ong, and so on. Now that we've looked at the various aspects of how tap participles and absolutives are formed, let's look at the use of these, and let's first of all focus on the use of participles. There are three main kinds of participle usage, and those are attributive, substantivized, and verbal. First of all, attributive basically means like an adjective, i.e. you have a participle standing together with a noun and describing a noun. However, when that happens in Sanskrit, a literal translation often is unidiomatic in English, and often a translation of the participle as a relative clause will be much better. For example, Dutang muktang pashyami. Pashyami means I see. Dutang means the messenger. And then we have muktang, which agrees with dutang. It means having been freed. And so the sentence as a whole literally is I see the having been freed messenger, or I see the freed messenger. Now that's not very idiomatic, and so a translation as I see the messenger who has been freed is a lot better. And what we've just done there is taken the participle and translated it as a relative clause. Another example, Narach muktach grama gaccheti. Gaccheti means he goes. Who goes? Narach is the subject, the man goes. Narach is described as muktach, meaning having been freed, and he goes grama, to his village or to the village. So literally this is the having been freed man goes to his village. Again, not very idiomatic, and it's much better to translate this as the man who was freed goes to his village. Next up, substantivized use, which basically means that a participle is used like a noun or like a substantive. Participles, just like regular adjectives, can be used on their own. And when that is the case, and they are in the masculine, we see them as referring to a man. When they stand in the feminine, we see them as referring to a woman. And when they stand in the neuter, we see them as referring to a thing. So, for example, of priya, dear, when that's used on its own and not to accompany another substantive, another noun, when it stands in the masculine, it would be translated as the dear man or a dear man, in the feminine, the dear woman or a dear woman, and the neuter, the dear thing or a dear thing. Exactly the same with participles. Mukta pashyati. Pashyati means he, she, it sees, so let's just translate it as he sees here. Muktam is the feminine accusative singular of mukta, means having been freed. And we don't translate this literally as he sees the having been freed feminine one, but instead the translation is he sees the freed woman, or even better, he sees the woman who has been freed. Finally, we have verbal use of a participle. This is when a participle is used instead of a finite verb. And we can recognize that this is what is happening whenever we have a sentence where there is no finite verb present. So, for example, if I have a sentence, narach purong gatach, then narach, plural men, purong, city, to the city, gatach, having gone, in the plural to agree with narach, then I cannot just translate this as the having gone to the city men, but rather I need to see that no, this is a complete sentence in itself, and the participle gatach, having gone, needs to be translated into English as a full finite verb, and so narach purang gatach would not be the having gone to the city men, but the men went to the city. The same works in the passive, puram drishtam. If that is used as a sentence of its own, as a complete sentence, then in English we need a finite verb. In Sanskrit there isn't one, we only have this tap participle here, drishtam. Puram means city, drishtam means having been seen or seen. We can't translate this as a complete sentence, the city having been seen. No, we need a finite verb, so this would then be the city was seen. Now, when you have a passive verb, you may want to express by whom something was done. So, for example, by whom the city was seen. And in Sanskrit, you can do that by means of a noun standing either in the instrumental or in the genitive case. So, for example, narena or narasya ashvach drishtach. Drishtach means having been seen. It's the ta participle of drish. And here we have it in a sentence that does not have a finite verb, so this participle into English needs to be translated as a finite verb, not having been seen, but it was seen. What was seen? Ashvach drishtach, the horse was seen. By whom? Narena or narasya, the word nara, man, either in the instrumental or the genitive case. In both of these, we need to translate into English by the man or by a man. And so the whole sentence is narena or narasya ashvach drishtach, by the man or by a man, the horse was seen. Now that we've finished looking at the various usages of the forms introduced at the beginning of the chapter, let's look at one more form, one more non-finite verb form, and this is the infinitive. Its meaning is to do, to run, to eat, and so on. And it is formed by adding the suffix tum to the verbal root in guna. So, for example, ni, meaning to lead, gives me the guna ne, and then I add tum to that to give me ne tum, which would be the infinitive of ni. Similarly with shru, put that into guna, giving you shro, add the suffix tum, and you have shro tum, the infinitive, to hear. In infinitives, we find the same formal variations as in tap participles and in absolutives. So, for example, sometimes an I appears in front of the tum suffix. Of pat, therefore, we have the infinitive patitum, to fall. Of bud, we have the same kind of buddha sandhi as we also saw in tap participles and absolutives. So, bud, the root ending in a voiced aspirate, causes the T of the tum to become voiced and aspirated itself, so to change into dum, and then the voiced aspirate at the end of the root loses its aspiration, and so instead of bud, we have bud. And finally the root appears in guna, so we have bod plus dum, giving us buddhum to understand. And finally, the behavior of nasals in front of stops is what we here see as well. So in front of the dental stop T, the labial nasal M at the end of gum changes into the dental nasal N, and so we have the infinitive gun tum to go. Now note that usually verbs form their participles, their ta participles, their absolutives and their infinitives in parallel. So for example, of pat, to fall, we have patita, patitwa, and patitum. And of bud, we have buddha, buddha, and bodhum, and so on. But of a very frequently used verb, namely bhu, we have the infinitive bhavitum with an I appearing, and the guna of the root appearing in its pre-vocalic form, so not bo, but bhavitum, bhavitum, even though this verb has as its ta participle and as its absolutive bhuta and bhutva. We need to look separately at the infinitives of class 10 verbs and of causatives because those are formed in a slightly different way. They are formed not on the basis of the root and guna, but you form them by taking the present tense stem minus the final a and by adding itum. So for example, of chintayati, he thinks, we have the infinitive chintayitum, and of the causative bharayati, he causes someone to carry, we then have the infinitive bharayitum. So you take the stem, chintaya, bharaya, you cut off the final a, and you add itum, giving you chintayitum and bharayitum respectively. Finally, how are infinitives used in Sanskrit? Well, it's fairly similar to what we find in English. They are used after verbs expressing to want to do something, to hope to do something, to intend or to go to do something, and so on. So, for example, nagaram gantum ichchami, I want to go to the city. Ichchami means I want to do what? I want to go, gantum. I want to go where? Nagaram in the accusative to the city. So nagaro gantum ichchami, I want to go to the city. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupal@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!